But a question that was brought up, a topic that was brought up in a recent conversation, and that's what I really like to base some of my topics on, is what people are talking about. We were talking about daylight saving time, and actually, daylight saving time will be coming to an end. We'll be going back to standard time this weekend, and year after year, we get into this discussion of whether daylight saving time actually means anything, or if we should be doing it at all. And I love to hear after it's kind of I've kind of laughed sometimes when I see on social media and Facebook, especially when people complain on the weekend that we change the clocks, that they hate people hate daylight saving time. Well, in fact, you don't hate daylight saving time. You actually hate standard time. Standard time or normal time is the time that we will be in the winter, and in the summer is daylight saving time. And there's been all sorts of theories out there about the history of it, and one of them is that for farmers they changed the clocks, and in fact that wasn't true. It was during World War I that it actually started to essentially conserve energy during the war effort. And they called it wartime. It wasn't necessarily called daylight saving time. Well, after World War One, we can talk about that in a bit, but then it came back in World War II. But in between the wars, they actually didn't have a national standard for changing the clocks. So each community did it on their own. And by each community, I mean every town, village, school district, railroad came up with their own plan. And they decided whether they did it, number one, and number two, they would decide when it happened. So everybody was doing it at different times if they did it at all. So you could have a school district and a village in the same community. This would be the 1920s into the 1930s. You could have a school district in a village that had two different times. Nightmare. So reading through the East Aurora Advertiser during that time period, people they had to actually put the time and tell you which time it was. They'd say fast time or slow time, and it became a mess. And it was actually hugely controversial. So in the news, you'll hear someone actually asked me recently whether we were having a discussion, and they were under the assumption that we were getting rid of, they said daylight saving time, but getting rid of standard time and doing a year-round daylight saving time. So that would mean that the time we are on right now would be carried out through the winter. And so people actually, we like daylight saving time today, but actually back in the 20s, the controversy was they were doing daylight saving time, and a lot of people, including at one point the editors of the East Aurora Advertiser, were saying that they called it actually poppycock time, daylight saving time, because standard is natural time, right? And we were shifting the clock, springing forward in the spring in order to create our own time. And it was to basically have more daylight when people were awake. So that was what happened during the war. So that way, if you have more daylight while you're awake, you'll have fewer hours that you're up. Most people were up in the dark. And then that would save on coal, oil, and those things for the war effort. So that was the original reason. But they were trying to save energy. That was the point of this. But it's become where it's more of a convenience. So in the 20s, there were a lot of people who didn't like that moving to daylight saving time. So when we didn't have daylight saving time, it's interesting to look back in the newspapers, and 4th of Julys were a big one. Like in the 1800s or the early 1900s, fireworks were at 8:30. You look and you're like, what? How did that happen? Well, they were still on standard time. They didn't have daylight saving time. So it got dark at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the summer here in East Aurora, before we started doing wartime or daylight saving time. So it really did shift how we did things, because our lives are based around daylight a lot, and especially before electricity. So if it got dark at 8:30 or 9 o'clock and you didn't have electricity in your home in the 1800s, you were using more candles and lanterns and things like that. And then when you got the gas utilities for lighting, you would be using more gas. So that was the point. But it would get lighter earlier in the morning, and more people would be up earlier. Well, we've changed how we live, and so we're up later. We just, I think, are, because we have TVs and radios, and, well, not radios so much anymore, but internet. We have a lot of things that we can do after dark, that people before us didn't necessarily have. So that was the controversy, and the advertiser editors I found interesting a couple times in their editorials just really didn't like the whole idea of daylight saving time, because what it did is it made it darker in the morning. But today we have this controversy again where people are thinking about extending daylight saving time throughout the year. So that would mean that on Saturday, actually Sunday morning, we wouldn't change our clocks. We would just keep on this fake time, essentially, is what the advertiser editors from the 1920s would have said. I'm just reading comments here. I try to do more than one thing at the same time, so thank you. The daylight saving time caused a huge amount of problems, and it's funny because this is one of those instances where local history matches national history. So one by one in each little town and community, this daylight saving time thing was causing problems. So each community in the United States could decide after, because essentially the Congress didn't say, oh, it's up to each community. Congress just didn't make a law after the war, after World War I. So each community essentially could do what they want. If they liked daylight saving time, they could adopt it. If they didn't have to. But again, each school district would decide, each town would decide, the village within the town could decide differently. The railroads usually stayed on standard time because they didn't want to cause problems. Now imagine you're getting on a train, and trains were much more important. Passenger trains were much more important back then than they are today. Where here in East Aurora it would be 10 o'clock, and you would arrive in West Seneca and it would be a totally different time. And then you'd arrive in Buffalo, it would be a totally different time. And it could happen that way, number one, whether a town adopted it or whether the timing of when they adopted it. So you could be, East Aurora could decide to do it, starting in April, but West Seneca could decide to start doing it in May. Most of the time they would figure out a date, but not everybody had to do it. And so not everybody did. So this caused a ton of problems. Children, kids were late to school or early to school, depending on the time of the year. So it just caused a mess. And actually, New York State did away with a statewide system in the early 1920s. They had a system which worked out better because everybody was on the same time statewide, and this is truly when it happened. So you had World War I, it was a federal wartime thing. New York State did it in the early 20s. Then New York State just stopped doing it, and that meant local communities could make up their own minds. There was a huge debate about it. So today we hear a debate, and it's kind of funny because we think it's the first time we're talking about daylight saving time, but it's not. This has been going on since the 1920s at least. And in some communities, they actually took a poll to see what people wanted. So for instance, local school boards would ask parents, what do you want? And in Orchard Park in the 1920s, the school board decided to go with whatever time the majority of the parents picked. So they sent out questionnaires. East Aurora did a similar thing. And there was a huge debate between village parents and those out in rural areas, that they had said that districts were, they called it advanced time and slow time. It was to have fast time was a hardship for daylight savings time, and would be a hardship for people out in rural areas because they didn't have time to get the chores done and get to the village schools. And so, but you had most people doing daylight savings time, but a few pockets weren't doing it. And so, there wasn't like a sign at the entrance to every community saying which time they were on. And then newspapers would have to tell you both times. Just got really confusing. So then they tried coming up with some compromises. And mind you, this is all because there was not a standardized system for daylight saving time. So a compromise actually in Orchard Park I read about in the newspapers as I was doing my research on this a couple years ago, is they were going to set the clocks ahead. So in the spring they would, Orchard Park schools, for instance, would adopt daylight saving time. So they'd set their clocks ahead, but classes would begin 20 minutes late. So, but this made matters even more confusing because they were trying to accommodate the students from rural areas that would be late because of the time being changed. But then imagine that's so confusing is like you tell them, class starts at 8:20 when it should start at 8, but it really isn't 8 because it's daylight saving time. What a mess. And then some businesses were, each business was reluctant to adopt daylight saving time, or some did and some didn't. So it was a mess. So this went on for several years until, again, World War II came along and there was a standardized wartime across the country, and that was to preserve resources. To conserve resources, so your utilities, any utilities, coal, oil, anything for lighting, and then people just started to give up. They just said we have to do this. In some communities, they just said we have to do daylight saving time because most people were deciding to do it. Again, I think it was more because of how we live our lives. And so in the summer, we stay up later. So to have a daylight saving time, you're just shifting. You're not gaining, and we all know this, but sometimes we forget it, that we're not gaining any time. We're just shifting it. So daylight saving time essentially gives us more light later in the summer. So I enjoy that. I enjoy it. And then less in the morning. And I think some of us feel like the light, it actually gets light out early enough, even with daylight saving time. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So 1960s come along, and that's when the federal government actually they were trying to standardize it. There were no standards until 1966, and they actually came up with a system in order to have a uniform time. So they actually had the Uniform Time Act that allowed for daylight saving time between the last Sunday in April and the last Sunday in October. And only entire states could, and I didn't know this until I did some research, which is interesting, but only entire states, not individual towns and villages, were allowed to exempt themselves. And then this was amended later to allow time zones to do their own thing. And then, of course, we have some places that don't observe daylight saving time. So 1960s come along and we have a standard daylight saving time. Everybody's doing it, or most people. Some areas are exempting themselves, and across the country we're all doing it at the same time and everybody's happy, right? Well, no. There is still this debate, and it's funny that you hear recently on social media, and because on social media we can talk about it more and more people talk about it and complain about, and we won't get into all that, but there are downsides and there's health issues that you hear doctors talk about the changing of the time and our bodies adjusting to switching by an hour every spring and every fall. And of course we've expanded daylight saving time, so now we changed the clocks earlier in the spring and we changed them later in the fall. But now there's a call for by some people to just extend daylight saving time through the winter. So because we feel it's better than standard time, right? Because we don't want it to be dark too early in the summer. And that will prevent us from having to change our clocks, and we will just be able to, we won't have to make those adjustments to our sleep schedules and everything twice a year. However, we've done this before and it didn't work. There was actually, and I didn't realize this until a friend of mine mentioned it, who now I was born in 1975, and so I have a friend who's a bit older than me and remembers going to school in 1973, 1974. And during the the oil embargo, we actually we needed to conserve oil. So in order to conserve energy, the government came up with this wonderful idea that we were going to extend daylight saving through the whole year. Well, when you do that in the winter, January and February, you're just pushing, so you're not bringing the clocks back to falling back. If you're not falling back, you're actually, it's dark in the morning now, and it keeps getting darker until December, till around Christmas time, the winter solstice. So it remains dark till like 8:30 in the morning if you don't switch back to standard time. So students were going to school in the dark. There were lots of reports. I did some research about this, but it was interesting. There were a debate over whether there were more accidents in the morning, pedestrian accidents with students going to school, because of this, or if it was just these accidents were happening in the morning instead of the afternoon, when if you were to go back to standard time, it gets darker earlier in the afternoon. So that debate was, they were trying to figure out, well, yeah, there were more accidents in the morning, but it might not have been because we kept daylight saving time. It might have been because we're just shifting those accidents and the darkness from the afternoon to the morning. However, all that aside, the accidents and the safety issues, people hated getting up and going to work and school in the dark. That was it. They much preferred to go home in the dark or be home at night having dinner and it being dark than to wake up and literally having it be dark at 9 a.m. And in some places, you have to remember, like the end of the Eastern time zone, the sun rises later the further west you go. So there were parts of the time zones as you go across the country that it was, really late when the sun was rising. So if it was 8:30 a.m., 9 a.m., it really affects the soul, doesn't it? Your mood, if you're getting up in the dark, and not only getting up in the dark, but having it be dark for a couple hours after you wake up and go to school or go to work. So people hated it. And this friend of mine who was talking about they were wearing like, glow in the dark or a reflective tape on their coats to go to school in the morning, and it just wasn't popular. So it was less of an issue probably with safety, because the arguments were, that you were just shifting the safety issue from the afternoon to the morning, and more that people just hated it. So it didn't last long. They tried daylight saving for a bit, probably I think it was just a year, it might have been 2, and they just got rid of it. They just they didn't like it, and it was never renewed. So we went back to doing daylight saving time in the summer and going back to standard time in the winter. So the other issue with getting rid of daylight saving time, so if we were to do it the opposite way, is how in the summertime the birds start chirping pretty darn early. Well, it would be even earlier if we kept standard time through the summer. So a lot of meteorologists who talk about this every year, will we debate whether we should be doing daylight saving time throughout the year or keeping standard time throughout the year and not switching the times. They'll argue, I have heard many of them on TV and elsewhere arguing that as hard as it is to change the clocks twice a year and adjust, it's even probably harder to live with the consequences of not changing the clocks. So my view is, from a historical standpoint, is that we keep changing the clocks and we live with the adjustment of it. Sometimes I wonder why we keep shortening standard time. That we used to do it, even September. We actually, long time ago, started in September changing the clocks, and now we do it in November, first week in November. But that we have to be careful what we ask for and what we wish for. So if we wish for daylight saving time throughout the whole year, we are going to have some, I think, making January, February, which are already tough enough months, making them even worse by having mornings where the light is later. Sun won't rise for a couple hours after most of us get up in the morning. And this is a great case of why we need to study history, because a lot of arguments I hear, or we all hear, about year-round daylight saving time, and you'll hear about the Congress is debating it, and actually there was a bill. They're making arguments that we already went through in 1973 and 1974, and you're just like, look back at that. We tried this before and it didn't work. So that's one of the things that I like, because it shows how important it is to study history. And not just from a national standpoint. Remember, we're talking local history here. Is to just delve into the history here in East Aurora. So, you just go back into the old newspapers, and you have just nightmare scenarios of the train schedules being off. And actually, 1930, there were daylight saving time was under fire in Albany. They were arguing, and Buffalo was strongly in favor of the change, and East Aurora followed Buffalo's lead, not necessarily because East Aurora liked daylight saving, but if East Aurora had a different time than Buffalo, and we did most of our business with Buffalo. The train went directly from here to Buffalo. Imagine that in 1930. If we had a different time, it would be a nightmare for East Aurora. And Buffalo, of course, had more influence over it. And so this debate went on and on and on. And every single time, the East Aurora Advertiser, they don't so much do it anymore because it's standardized, but they would have an article about all the people who were late for church, because they always seem to do it on a Saturday or Sunday, early Sunday morning, so it wouldn't affect so many people. But this, we laugh today about, people are late for church, or they're early for church, depending on what time of the year it was. And this happened all the time. This is not a new problem. This is not a new phenomenon. So history is repeating itself. So most times people will, if once they know the history of it and know why we do it, I think, that's my opinion, that people will want to do daylight saving time, because the alternative just isn't as good, I think. So I wrote an article a couple years ago about daylight saving time in East Aurora specifically, the different issues that came up with the school district and the towns, and just East Aurora versus Orchard Park and the city of Buffalo and all the different things. And so I'll post that in the comments once we're done here. But so I thought this was a neat topic because we talk about it quite a bit. I actually had a friend who texted me the other day and said, are we still changing our clocks? Because they had heard and I'm not a clock expert or a Congress expert, but they had heard about the bill that was being considered to keep daylight saving throughout the year. We have not done that, so we will be changing our clocks in November. And if history is any indication, we're probably going to keep with daylight saving time. It might change. We might not be doing it the same weekend every year, but if history is any indication, we'll be doing daylight saving time from here on out. It just doesn't, I don't see there'll be any, or if we do try it, we'll probably learn the same lesson they learned in 1974 and move right back to doing daylight saving time, or doing, see, we always get this mixed up, doing daylight savings time and not doing standard time, but I think we'll just continue to be doing it. Because again, the alternatives are just not better than what we have now. It's not a perfect system, and that's the problem. If we the grass is greener, always greener on the other side, and we always like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have daylight saving time all year? And history shows us that it won't be great to have daylight saving time all year. So I welcome your comments. We're running out of time here. Just a little bit. I will again post that article that I wrote a couple years ago. It's actually more than a couple years ago now, with some more details. You can also, on the Aurora Town Historian page, for several years, I've posted clippings from the Easter Advertiser related to daylight saving time. So if you want to know more about some of the confusion that happened, or how another big issue was reminding people about it, because it was a foreign concept. Imagine during the war you're saying to people you have to switch your clocks. I mean, today we just do it, and we have enough trouble with the clock on the microwave or in our car. But imagine the first time in trying to educate the public on how to do it and why we're doing it, and again, who's doing it, and what it means. So I'll post that article in the comments in a bit. Also, next week we will be discussing, I know a lot of you don't watch this live, you watch it later, but when we go live it will be election day. So I thought it would be fun to maybe do the top 10, it might be a little more, might be a few less, top 10 East Aurora related election day historical facts and things you might not have known about. I was enlightened quite a bit through my research about women's suffrage, about a literacy requirement. We can talk a little about that. We often think that that was something just in the South. Oh no, it was here in New York as well. So next week we'll chat at 3 o'clock as usual about we'll celebrate Election Day, commemorate Election Day with a discussion of the top 10 Election Day historical facts from East Aurora's history. Thanks for joining us, and again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comments anytime. Or if you have a topic you want to talk about, please do the same, and we'll see you next week.